Hollywood has had a monopoly on the film industry for decades. Starting in the silent movie era and moving into our highly digital age, American film has and continues to dominate screens across the globe. Despite this overbearing presence, many countries have produced storytellers with a drive to explore their own roots and instead steer away from the mainstream. Becoming more present with the aid of digital technologies, these storytellers are not in fact new and have existed almost as long as cinema. It is the aforementioned Hollywood that takes the spotlight, and many films local to other countries are rarely seen by most. This cultural imperialism of the film industry is evident, and although containing magnificent works of art in their own right, is responsible for its effects on international movies. Seen are Hollywood in 1935 and a still from the German dystopian film Metropolis. H. J. Whitley established Hollywood as a wealthy residential area from the 1890s onwards. By 1911, the first film studio in the area had been established, and 20 companies were creating films. Following that, in 1915, was arguably the start of cinema as we know it today, with the release of the film The Birth of a Nation. As the First World War began, the European film industry declined. At the time, it was larger and more influential than American cinema. However, Hollywood rose in dominance as the United States' infrastructure was still intact. Following the war, many European filmmakers immigrated to the States and began producing films there. This, combined with migrating actors from New York and the introduction of sound in cinema, led to a rapid evolution of film and massive growth of audiences and productions, right up until the 1940s, where Hollywood was at its height. The European world of film has stayed lagging behind ever since the First World War. The reasons within have been theorized. Gerben Bakker discusses this in the Scene Report. He suggests that an increase in sunk costs throughout America's fast growth phase led to a higher concentration of US films. And by the time Europe had recovered from World War One, they were unable to catch up with the already booming Hollywood. Others theorize that because of shares in the European film market already starting to drop in 1910, 4 years before the war, that it was eventually going to happen anyway. Although the war most definitely pushed this decline to the extreme, it's hard to summarize what would have happened without it. Cultural proximity can also be taken into question, as when America became the biggest in film, the fact they spoke English and shared many traits with countries like the UK and Australia filtered the majority of the international audience completely away from European cinema altogether. Marshall McLuhan's concept of the global village can also be applied in this dynamic. The instantaneous sharing and consumption of media that we live in every day was slowly becoming a part of cinema at this time. Although technology had not yet developed to today's extent, it was well on the way. Think of the 1900s as the start of its development. In this instance, by the 20s, we had sound, color, and the biggest production of cinema in history. Over time, the distance and lack of communication between countries shrunk, but the content grew. This massive ballooning of constant productions and shrinking of tedious pathways meant it was harder for European filmmakers to establish themselves as artists. And as attention was taken away and drawn to Hollywood, opportunities would often fall off, and more immigrated to California as it had become the home of film. So, in conclusion, we've established that although World War One dramatically affected European cinema, Hollywood's rapid expansion led to the suppression and overall shrinking of European cinema presence. Although films continued to be made across Europe, they were only ever a minority in comparison to the US, and as a result, many filmmakers decided to make the move to Hollywood.